They laughed at her scars. Not always out loud. Sometimes it was just a glance that lingered too long. A whisper passed between friends. A giggle barely hidden behind a coffee cup. But Abby noticed. She always noticed. She worked the morning shift at Rosie's Diner, a quiet place on the edge of town, where truckers came for their eggs and office workers picked up their black coffee before disappearing into glass buildings. Her job was simple: refill the sugar jars, wipe the counters, and take orders with a smile. But smiling had become the hardest part. A burn scar stretched from Abby's left cheek down her neck, a jagged memory of a house fire 3 years ago. It twisted slightly when she spoke. And in a world obsessed with filters and flawlessness, it made people uncomfortable. A teenage boy once told her she looked like a villain from a comic book. A woman once asked if she was allowed to serve food looking like that. Even regulars, who never said anything cruel, rarely looked her in the eye. Like kindness was too awkward to offer. Abby never responded. She just kept pouring coffee. Until the day the Marines walked in. It was a quiet Tuesday morning. Gray skies, light drizzle. Abby was alone on the floor. Her coworker, Sherry, had called in sick. The bell above the door jingled, and in walked 3 men, tall, broad, unmistakably military. Camouflage uniforms, boots still muddy, sharp eyes that scanned the room like they were used to sizing up danger. They chose a corner booth. Abby grabbed 3 menus and walked over. "Morning," she said, voice even. "Coffee to start?" The one in the middle, tan skin, shaved head, a scar running along his eyebrow, looked up. His gaze didn't flinch when it landed on her face. "Yes, ma'am. 3 coffees. And if it's okay, we'll be staying a while." She nodded and turned to leave. But as she passed the booth behind them, she heard it. "Poor thing. Can't believe she shows her face like that in public." A young couple. Laughing. Not even bothering to whisper. Abby's fingers tensed around the coffee pot. She kept walking. But the Marine with the scar, his head snapped toward the sound like a dog catching a scent. He said nothing at first. Just stared. Then slowly stood up. In that moment, something in the diner shifted. The quiet hum stopped. Forks paused midair. Conversations froze. He walked past Abby. Straight to the couple. The woman shrank back instinctively. He didn't raise his voice. "What did you say?" he asked, voice low but sharp. The man stuttered. "It was just a joke." "Is it funny," the Marine asked, "that someone survived fire?" "No, I didn't mean." "You didn't think." "That's the problem." Abby stood frozen. Heart pounding. She had never been defended before, not like this. Not by a stranger. Not in public. The Marine didn't wait for a reply. He walked back to his booth, sat down, and calmly added, "Make that 4 coffees, please. She's joining us." Abby blinked. "Me?" He smiled. "Yeah. Sit with us. Just for a bit." The couple behind her left, red-faced and silent. And the rest of the diner? Silent too. But not for long. Because the next day, something happened that would shake the entire town. The Marines came back. But this time, they didn't come alone. The next morning, Abby expected things to go back to normal. The stares. The whispers. The quiet cruelty that came with routine customers. People forgot easily in this town. Kindness rarely lasted beyond a day. She stepped into Rosie's Diner at 6 a.m. sharp, tying her apron in the back room like she always did. Her heart still fluttered from yesterday, from the moment that stranger told her to sit, like she belonged. But she knew better than to hope too much. Then, at 6:42 a.m., she heard it. Boots. Not just one pair. Dozens. The solid, deliberate rhythm of military boots hitting tile in unison. It echoed like thunder across the diner's floor. She turned toward the entrance. They came in, 2 by 2. Tall, silent, uniformed. Marines. 15? No, maybe 20 of them. All shapes, all skin tones, all walking with the same quiet confidence, like they'd been called to war. The room stilled. A man in a suit put down his coffee. A teenager froze, mid-bite. Even the cook peeked out from the kitchen, spatula dangling in his hand. The leader was the same Marine from the day before, the one with the scar on his eyebrow. He stepped forward and looked at Abby. "Good morning, ma'am," he said. "We're here for breakfast." She blinked, stunned. "You brought the whole base?" He smirked. "Just Alpha Company. Echo might swing by later." They filled every booth. Every table. One even pulled up a stool at the counter, right across from Abby. She could barely keep her hands from shaking as she poured coffee after coffee, order after order. And still, more came. By 7:15 a.m., the diner was full. But it wasn't just the Marines anymore. Civilians started walking in, some with American flags on their jackets, others in old military caps. A veteran in a wheelchair rolled in with help from a younger Marine. A woman in scrubs came straight from the hospital, still wearing her badge. They all ordered. They all tipped. And they all looked Abby in the eye. No one laughed. No one whispered. When Abby brought out a tray of eggs and bacon, the scarred Marine stood up again. He tapped his glass with a fork, calling for quiet. "I want to say something," he said, voice firm but calm. "Yesterday, I heard someone mock this woman. I watched her carry it with grace. Most of you didn't say anything. Maybe you were too scared. Maybe you thought it wasn't your business." He looked around the room. "But it is your business. Because if we don't speak up when someone's being hurt, we become part of the hurt. And I'm not here to let that happen." He turned to Abby. "This woman survived something most of us couldn't imagine. She's not a victim. She's a warrior. And if you can't see the beauty in her strength, maybe it's not her scars that are the problem." A few people clapped. Then more. Then the whole diner erupted in applause. Abby stood still, a tear sliding down her cheek. No one had ever said those words out loud. No one had ever stood for her like that. Then the bell above the door jingled again. Another group of uniformed men and women walked in. Echo Company had arrived. Rosie's diner had never been that loud. Or that full. People lined up outside, holding umbrellas in the drizzle, waiting for a seat. Inside, uniforms outnumbered civilians. Plates clattered, laughter bounced off the chrome walls, and the smell of coffee and pancakes hung thick in the air. But Abby barely noticed. She was moving like she'd never moved before, faster, lighter, more alive. Not because of the rush. She'd worked rushes before. But because of the eyes. They saw her now. Really saw her. No one looked away when she came to their table. No one pretended not to notice her face. And if they did glance at the scar, it wasn't with pity or disgust. It was with quiet respect. The scarred Marine, now known to Abby as Sergeant Mallet Grant, had stayed near the counter, sometimes helping refill cups, sometimes telling jokes loud enough to make nearby booths laugh. He made it feel like she was safe inside a shield of warriors. And she was. Because when the whispers returned, and they did, something happened. Around noon, a group of men in buttoned-up shirts came in, clearly uncomfortable with the sea of camouflage. One of them muttered something under his breath as Abby passed. Probably faked the whole thing for attention. Women do that now, don't they? Before she could react, a tall Marine from Echo Company rose from his table. Not angry. Not loud. He simply walked over, placed a firm hand on the man's shoulder, and said, "Sir, I suggest you take your lunch elsewhere." The man scoffed. "Is that a threat?" "No. It's a request, from 20 men and women trained to break down doors in hostile zones." The man turned pale and left without another word. More applause. Abby stood behind the counter, hands still shaking. But this time, it wasn't from fear. It was something else. Dignity. Sergeant Grant leaned over. You okay? She nodded, barely able to speak. I think. I've been holding my breath for 3 years. He gave a soft smile. Well, breathe. You've earned it. By mid-afternoon, Rosie, the actual owner of the diner, a stern woman in her 70s, came out of the back, apron stained and face flushed. Abby, she said, gruffly. Take a break. I'm okay, I can keep going. No, hon, I said take a break. These Marines didn't come here to make you serve them. They came here for you. Rosie gestured toward the back corner, where a small table had been cleared. Flowers sat in a cup. A slice of pie waited next to a tall glass of lemonade. 3 Marines stood by with big grins. Abby blinked at the gesture, then at Rosie. Is this okay? She asked, hesitant. Me, taking up a table? Rosie crossed her arms. You've served more coffee in this place than I ever have. You deserve a whole wing named after you. Now go sit down. Abby walked slowly to the table. As she did, every Marine in the diner stood up. Silently. In rows, as if in formation. They didn't salute. They didn't need to. Their silence spoke louder than any words. The entire room paused to honor a woman they didn't know, not for what she'd done, but for what she had endured. And survived. Abby sat down, cheeks flushed, hands trembling, heart full. But the day wasn't over yet. Because someone else was about to walk through the door. Someone from her past. The bell above the door rang again. It was a softer jingle this time. Slower. Hesitant. Abby didn't look up right away. She was still sitting at the booth, her fork frozen halfway to her mouth, the pie untouched. But the atmosphere shifted. The kind of shift you feel more than see. Conversations dulled. Chairs squeaked as heads turned. Even the Marines, loud just moments ago, went still. Abby finally looked toward the door. And the color drained from her face. A man stood in the doorway, tall, lean, maybe late 40s. Dressed in a weather jacket and jeans, a duffel bag slung over one shoulder. His eyes locked onto Abby's, wide with disbelief. And guilt. Her breath caught. It was him. The man who left. 3 years ago, on a cold November night, Abby's apartment had caught fire. Faulty wiring, they said. A spark behind the kitchen wall turned into flames that swallowed her home. She barely escaped. Smoke-filled lungs. Collapsing stairs. Scalding heat licking her face. But the worst part wasn't the fire. It was waking up in the hospital and realizing Michael, the man she loved, never came. No call. No visit. No goodbye. He'd vanished the night she needed him most. Now he stood in front of her, with eyes that begged for forgiveness. Abby, he whispered. The name fell from his lips like it still belonged to him. Every eye in the diner was on them. But it felt like the world had narrowed to a tunnel. Just the two of them. Old ghosts. Unfinished pain. I didn't know how to face you, he said, stepping forward. I thought you'd be angry. That you'd hate me. That I wasn't strong enough. You weren't, Abby said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut like glass. You left me when I couldn't even look at myself. And now you walk in because you saw some news clip? Or heard people talking about the scarred waitress with an army behind her? Michael's mouth opened, but nothing came out. Sergeant Grant stood nearby. Watching. Not interfering. Letting Abby decide how this would go. Michael stepped closer. I never stopped thinking about you. You stopped showing up. That's what mattered. She stood now. Her chair scraping against the floor. You don't get to return just because now I'm surrounded by people who value me. Where were you when I felt like a monster? When I was learning how to live again with a face that made children cry? Tears burned behind her eyes. But she didn't let them fall. "Do you know who was there?" she asked, voice shaking. "A nurse named Sheila. A surgeon with kind hands. And me. I was there. For every step of healing. Every scream in the mirror. Every dream where I burned all over again." Michael lowered his head. "I'm sorry," he said, quietly. "I forgive you," she replied. He looked up, surprised. "But that doesn't mean you belong in my life." Michael swallowed hard. He seemed to shrink, then turned slowly and walked out the door. The bell jingled again. Abby sat back down. Silence hung in the air, not awkward, not cold, but heavy with respect. Grant walked over and sat across from her. That was brave. Abby let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. It was necessary. She picked up her fork, finally took a bite of the pie. "Still warm?" Grant smiled. "We keep the important stuff warm." Outside, rain tapped gently against the glass. Inside, something had changed. Not just in Abby, but in everyone who had watched her stand tall and speak the words they themselves had never dared say. But the biggest change was still coming. Because the next morning, the media showed up. By sunrise, Rosie's diner was surrounded. Not by soldiers this time, but by cameras, microphones, vans with satellite dishes, and reporters with perfect smiles and polished shoes. News crews. Bloggers. Influencers with ring lights and phones glued to their hands. They wanted to know about her. The scarred waitress. The woman who silenced a diner full of judgment. The one the Marines stood for. It started with a cell phone video, shaky, but powerful. It showed Abby standing in the middle of the diner, her hands trembling, her eyes full of fire, as she told off the man from her past. It showed Sergeant Grant and his men watching in quiet solidarity. And it ended with a single sentence that echoed far beyond town limits. "I forgive you. But that doesn't mean you belong in my life." The clip hit social media overnight. By morning, it had been viewed 2.3 million times. And Abby? She didn't know any of it. Not at first. She was in the back room folding napkins, unaware that the outside world had suddenly decided she was a symbol of courage. Rosie came in holding her phone. "Abby, sweetie. I think you need to see this." Abby squinted at the screen. "What is that?" Rosie's eyes sparkled. "You." The clip played. And as it ended, Abby sat in stunned silence. "I didn't know someone was filming." "They were. And I'm glad they did," Rosie said. "Now the world gets to see what we've seen all along." By noon, a local reporter was waiting outside. Then a national one. Then 3. They offered interviews, TV appearances, even a documentary deal. Brands emailed to collaborate. Strangers dropped off flowers. Kids stood in line asking for autographs. But Abby didn't change. She still brewed the coffee. Still wiped the counters. Still said thank you after every tip. Only now, people looked her in the eyes when they answered back. One older woman came in and waited until the line cleared. Then she stepped up, gently placed her hand over Abby's, and whispered, "My daughter has a scar on her back from an accident. She hides it. Maybe now, she won't." Another, a young man with a stutter, nervously held out a folded letter. I saw your video. I just wanted to say, thank you. For standing up. For being real." The Marines kept coming, too. Not all at once now, but in small groups. They came not for the show, not for the attention, but for the quiet understanding between people who had seen pain and carried it like a badge. Sergeant Grant came every morning. Sat at the same counter stool. Sometimes talked. Sometimes just sipped his coffee beside her. No cameras. No grand speeches. One morning, Abby asked him, "Why did you do it? That first day? Why speak up for someone you didn't know?" Grant shrugged. "Because I do know you." She blinked. "What do you mean?" I've seen soldiers burned in war. I've seen what it does to them, not just their skin, but their soul. And I've seen the world turn away, pretend not to notice. You had the same look in your eyes. Like you were invisible. He paused. I wanted you to know you weren't. Abby swallowed hard. Her voice almost broke. Thank you. Grant nodded. We fight for more than land, Abby. We fight so people like you can stand tall and know they're worth something, scars and all. That night, when the last customer left and the blinds were drawn, Abby stood alone in the diner. She looked in the mirror behind the counter, not to check her hair, not to hide the scar, but to really see herself. And for the first time in 3 years, she smiled at her reflection. Not despite the scar, but because of it. It had been a week since the story exploded. A week since Rosie's Diner became a landmark, not for its pancakes, but for its people. And Abby? She was still there every day. Not because she had to be, but because she wanted to be. The diner was her anchor. Her quiet battlefield. The place where she'd fought shame and loneliness, and won. But the town around her had changed. Something strange had begun to happen. People walked in differently. Slower. Softer. Kinder. The same customers who once avoided her gaze now asked how she was doing, and waited for the answer. Teens who had once whispered in the corner now came in to leave folded notes on napkins, thanking her for being strong when I couldn't. Even the man from the insurance office, the one who used to order double espresso with a side of silence, brought her a homemade apple pie with a nervous grin. It wasn't just pity. It was respect. A small chalkboard appeared by the entrance. Someone had written, "This is a place where scars are welcome. All kinds." Below that, people began leaving their stories, not just physical wounds, but emotional ones. A nurse wrote about losing a patient. A teacher described her panic attacks. A teenage boy confessed he used to wear long sleeves to hide his self-harm scars. And every single one ended the same way. But I'm healing. And I'm not hiding anymore. Rosie, ever the practical one, shook her head and mumbled, "Didn't think a diner would become a therapy center, but here we are." Then she smiled. One morning, Abby arrived to find a mural being painted across the side of the building. She blinked in shock. At the center was a woman, a silhouette with wild, windswept hair. Her face bore a streak of red, like a burn, and it glowed in the rising sun. Around her, figures in uniform stood tall, forming a wall behind her. At the bottom, bold letters read, "Strength has a face." A local artist had started it. Volunteers, including Marines and teens from the high school, were helping finish it. Abby stood watching, unsure whether to laugh or cry. That night, Sergeant Grant stopped by again, a small gift in his hand, a box, tied with navy ribbon. She opened it. Inside was a medal. "Purple Heart," she whispered, confused. "It's mine," he said. "I was injured overseas. Got this for it. But it's just metal. I kept it in a drawer for years." He looked her in the eye. "But what you did, standing in that diner, day after day, carrying that pain and still showing up with dignity. That deserves more honor than a battlefield." Abby's voice cracked. "I can't take this." "Yes, you can," he said gently. "Because you remind people that scars aren't signs of weakness. They're survival stories." She held the medal to her chest like it was the most precious thing she'd ever received. That night, the diner was full again. But this time, it wasn't just for the food. People gathered for something else, something no one had expected. A ceremony. The mayor had caught wind of it all. So had the town council. And though Abby never wanted the spotlight, they insisted. They named that day Abby Carson Day, a tribute not to a hero in a uniform, but to the quiet courage of a woman who refused to let the world make her feel small. As she stood on a small stage near the mural, holding the Purple Heart in her hand, the crowd erupted in cheers. But her eyes weren't on the cameras or the reporters. They were on the people who once laughed. Many were there. Some clapped slowly, unsure how to make amends. Abby gave them a soft smile. Because she'd already forgiven them. She didn't need apologies. She had something better now. She had peace. But just when she thought the story had reached its end, a letter arrived. From someone she'd never expected. The envelope was plain. No logo. No return address. Just her name, handwritten in a shaky script across the front. Abby Carson. She found it on the diner counter one morning, tucked between a stack of receipts and the sugar jar. No one saw who left it. For a moment, she considered not opening it. She had received so many letters lately, fan mail, thank you notes, job offers, even invitations to speak at conferences about resilience and healing. But this one felt different. She peeled the envelope open slowly, carefully. Inside was a single page. No signature. Just words. Dear Abby. I was one of them. The ones who stared. Who whispered. I never laughed out loud, but I laughed in my head. I judged you. I looked at your scar and saw something ugly. Because I was scared. Of pain. Of difference. Of anything that reminded me that life could hurt. But then I watched what happened here. I saw the Marines. I saw how you stood tall, even when someone tried to shrink you. I watched the way you forgave, not just the man who left, but all of us. Even people like me, who never earned it. I needed to say, I'm sorry. But more than that, I needed to say, thank you. Because you changed something in me. You made me look at myself. At the scars I try to hide. And I realized, yours aren't ugly. They're honest. And maybe mine can be too. You reminded me that being broken doesn't mean being worthless. It just means we're still here. Still standing. Still healing. With respect. Someone who sees you now. Abby read it twice. Then again. She folded the letter neatly and slipped it into her apron pocket, her fingers trembling. That evening, as the diner emptied out and the last booth was wiped clean, she walked to the restroom, not to fix her hair or wash her hands. But to look. She stood in front of the mirror. The same mirror she had once avoided. The same reflection she had turned from so many mornings, heart aching with the weight of what she'd lost. The scar was still there. Of course it was. But now, when she looked at it, she didn't see shame. She saw a map. A trail of survival. A reminder that she had walked through fire, and come out the other side still whole. Abby took a lipstick from her bag. Not to cover the scar, she didn't do that anymore. Instead, she uncapped it and wrote a single word on the mirror, bold and red. Seen. She stepped back and looked at it, her reflection smiling through the word. Outside the diner, the sun was setting. Marines sat on the hood of a truck, laughing softly. Children drew chalk hearts on the sidewalk. Rosie stood by the door, arms crossed, pretending not to cry. And Abby? She walked out into the street, no hat, no scarf, no shield. Just herself. Unhidden. Unapologetic. Whole. People still glanced. But now they looked with wonder. Not because she was scarred. But because she was free.